Welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Judith Levine, the Director of the Public Policy Lab. Today's event is one of our policy roundtables, which are panel discussions that we hold twice a year. But this is a special one because we are inaugurating a new e-magazine called the Lab Report, which will be published annually. The first issue features essays written by today's panelists. Today's panel and the Lab Report grew out of the Public Policy Lab's goal of building conversation across academic researchers, policymakers, advocates, and the community. The Public Policy Lab, or PPL, is an interdisciplinary research center of the College of Liberal Arts at Temple University. For this event and for all of our activities, we are deeply grateful to Dean Richard Deeg, Senior Associate Deans Hiram Alderando and Sandra Suarez. I'm honored that Dean Deeg is here to welcome us before we start our session. Dean Deeg, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you and welcome to today's roundtable. We created the Public Policy Lab a few years ago when we thought about the fact that there were so many faculty in our college and at Temple with an interest in public policy, but also many faculty did research that was relevant to policy, even if they didn't think of themselves as doing work related to public policy. And we felt there was an opportunity, but also an obligation, particularly as a public university, to use the resources and the fact that we have to try and address public policy problems and challenges more specifically. So we created the Public Policy Lab with Judith as our inaugural director. She's done a fantastic job to promote research in the college, to translate that research into policy relevant forms, to disseminate research, and also to collaborate with practitioners in government and the private sector in trying to address and solve policy challenges. And today's roundtable is an example of the latter, where she's brought together folks from different parts of our society who have a common interest in solving the housing challenge. And so I want to thank Judith and her team for this leadership of the PPL, and I want to thank all of our participants today for being here. In the near future, we'll be doing these in person, I hope. But it's great that you're all willing and able to do this via Zoom. So once again, welcome, and I look forward to listening to the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Deeg, and both for today and for your support of PPL in general. My PPL colleague, Colin Hammer, and I also thank Gregory Heller, who advised us on today's event. And with great pleasure, I will now introduce our panelists. Given time, I am not going to do anyone justice, but say just briefly who we have here with us today. In alphabetical order, we have Anne Fadullon, who is Philadelphia's Deputy Mayor for Planning and Development. Thank you, Anne. Diana Lind is an urban policy specialist and the author of the new book, Brave New Homes, Our Future in Smarter, Simpler, Happier Housing. She is also currently serves as the Executive Director of the Arts and Business Council for Greater Philadelphia. Samantha R. Porter is a community engagement advisor and outreach manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Vincent Reina is with us. Dr. Reina is associate professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania. Nikil Saval is state senator for the 1st Senatorial District in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And Tayyib Smith is senior principal at Little Giant Creative and a partner at Smith & Roller and The Collective, which is committed to equitable development planning in marginalized Philadelphia communities. Without further delay, let's begin the conversation. I'll pose questions to the panelists for about an hour, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. Let's start, before we dive into talking about solutions, let's start just by putting on the table what some of the challenges are. in terms of the housing crisis. So if I could turn first to Senator Saval and ask you just, we have a wide audience today, people who whose work solely is on the housing crisis and people who were just generally interested. So if you could just put on the table, what is the housing crisis? And maybe you could quickly outline some of the various elements of the problem.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you to first of all, to Temple, to the Public Policy Lab, to Dean Deeg, and just really honored to be on a panel with such distinguished and knowledgeable panels. I'm excited to learn. So what I would say is, I mean, this is obviously a big question. We did happen to have in just about last month, a Democratic policy hearing hosted by my office on the housing crisis in Pennsylvania in particular. And really the point of that was to create a forum to hear about how the dynamics of the housing crisis play out across the state. And so we had a lot of testimony at that hearing, and we heard from, among other people, we heard from a single mother of 3 whose story shows just how expensive it is to be poor. She became homeless because of the COVID crisis. She ended up spending about $4,000 in rental application fees, only to be told that she wasn't qualified for a rental unit because her monthly income was not 3 times the monthly rent at the place she applied for. She ended up spending $745 a week to stay in a hotel. And her monthly rent before she was evicted was $585. And a month in the hotel cost her $3,016. We heard from a survivor of domestic violence. She was arrested related to a dispute with her abuser and wound up with a criminal record because of this dispute that not only limited her access to employment, but also her eligibility for affordable housing programs. And in an effort to secure a better future for her son, her mom, who doesn't have a record, helped her rent a unit in a richer area with a better resourced public school. But then as she struggled to pay the rent there, the unit started to deteriorate around her. Flooding led to there was a huge mold problem in her unit, but she stayed because it was worth it for her school until her son's annual checkup, where she, and now I'm going to quote her testimony because this is important, learned his lead levels were high, but not high enough to get justice. Not only could I not hold the landlord accountable, I couldn't leave. I wanted to get out of that house immediately for my kids' safety, but our landlord wouldn't let me out of the lease. I felt trapped. I felt like we were preyed upon. The landlord knew we were desperate for a house we could afford in that area, and he took advantage. He got away with poisoning my kid to make a profit. And the rest of the testimony touched on the impact of out-of-state investors on property values in predominantly Black neighborhoods, the difficulty individuals who require adaptive modifications experience in finding a unit, and the rapidly approaching or ballooning utility debt crisis, which I think is exemplified by a staggering statistic, which puts utility unaffordability into perspective, which is that in 2019, some low-income homeowners households paid up to 31% of their income on energy costs alone. 31%. This is not even including rental burden, leaving very little to pay for rent, food, transportation, childcare, clothing, medicine, etc. So you have a story of a criminal record limiting access to housing. Criminal records force people to accept conditions that would otherwise be unlivable. The crisis is essentially multifaceted. It isn't an urban crisis. It affects people across Pennsylvania. It affects people in more affluent areas. It is intersectional. It's compounded by race, gender, sexual orientation, and it is a supply problem, a utility problem, and tightly woven with poverty, with the stagnant wage crisis, which renders a market rate rental unit in Pennsylvania an impossibility for any full-time worker earning a minimum wage. So that is the scale, the scope, and I've only, I feel like, begun really to address the kind of like facets of the crisis, but that is one version, I would say, of what the housing crisis is.
Thank you. And obviously, this is a very difficult thing to say in just a minute or two. So I appreciate your getting us started. So let me turn now to Anne Fadullon. and ask, when cities, you are the head of much of the programming around housing in the city, and when cities have the freedom to innovate, they create creative programming that's tailored to local needs. Of course, it's hard to fund such programs without federal support. Can you talk a bit about these tensions, about the level, the tension between the value of city kind of control of innovation, but the need for federal funding, and what that was like prior to the pandemic and now during the pandemic?
So I think, a lot of local governments feel like our hands are tied based on the requirements that come with the federal dollars that we get. And predominantly the federal housing dollars that we've gotten for the last several decades are community development block grant funds, often referred to as CDBG, home dollars, which is capital HOME, which is just home, right? Doesn't stand for anything else. And those are sort of the big buckets. And I think why you've seen a lot of local governments, Philadelphia included, try to identify how they can get access to local resources is because of all those restrictions that come from with the federal dollars that really tie our hands around innovation. So for example, we predominantly use our federal dollars to fund low-income housing tax credit projects. That model has been the same model for 30 plus years. And it's not that it's not an effective model, but it's not the most effective model. And that's, it's not evident that one model treats everything and is the best for every locality. And so I think, we've really tried to figure out how we can take our local dollars. So we have a couple sources of that. We have a recording fee housing trust fund, which means when there's a transfer of real estate, there's some recording fees. Those fees are dedicated to go into a local housing trust fund. And then we also have a commitment from the mayor that the first year of the tax abatement burn-off will go into what's called the other housing trust fund, if you will, right? And with those flexible dollars, we tried to come up with other types of programs that allow us a broader range of services. Some of the things that we're pushing back on as far as the federal level, for example, the latest round of federal support from the Biden stimulus is $42 million coming to provide homeless assistance. It's coming through the home program. The home program guidelines really do not lend itself to address quickly the homeless issue. So I'll just give you a quick example. So one of the things that has been in the news a lot is, during the pandemic, FEMA funds were allowed to be able to put people into hotels temporarily to get them out of a congregate shelter type living facility, which is all those beds next to each other, not healthy during COVID. When the FEMA funds ran out, we had to take a lot of people out of these hotels. So the feds are saying, we're going to give you money so that you can either acquire a hotel or some kind of other facility like that, or just get a master lease and lease all those, because a lot of these hotels, we did not buy the hotel. We just contacted the hotel owner or operator, and we temporarily lease those facilities. Under the home program, anybody coming out of shelter has what they call housing choice, which is great, right? We want choice, but it means that it really precludes the city from entering into a master lease with a hotel or some kind of units like that, and just saying, okay, all you 50 people ready to go out of shelter, we've got these units for you, we're going to move you over here. No, instead we have to say, we're offering you rental assistance, you get to pick from any unit you can find, as long as somebody's willing to. And that whole process can take somebody who's not prepared to go through that process, right? Someone coming out of shelter might not even know how to access the rental market, and you're given a limited window of time. And if you can't find the unit in that time, oh, well, we got to go on to the next person. And it really doesn't facilitate the quick transfer to get people moving out of shelter into a more either transitional or permanent housing situation. And what happens is then our whole system backs up, right? Can't move people out of the shelter. We run out of shelter beds. People are like, why are all these people on the street? We can't have our system clogged in any way. And that's just one example. That's just one example of the federal restrictions that really don't allow us for the flexibility. And I will just say this one other thing. We are provided a lot of capital dollars. We are not provided dollars to actually operate those units. Housing costs money. You cannot operate it for free, right? And so we are always also pushing that point.
Thank you, Anne. Moving to Vincent Reina, you direct a center called Housing Initiative at Penn. The center pays a lot of attention to cost burden and to programs that are designed to address it. We consider those who spend more than 30% of their income on housing to be cost burdened. Can you tell us who is most likely to be cost burdened, what level of need there is for rental assistance, and how this relates to rates of eviction?
You know, generally we rely on this 30% number as a measure for housing cost burden. I would say, to kind of speak to already one of the points Nikil made, is that in many ways that usually just talks about housing costs, but not all of the other things associated with housing. So we know that the cost of utilities are quite high, particularly in lower cost units where the quality of that unit might be less, and therefore systems are more leaky. There's less ability to kind of control utility consumption, things like that. And so, you know, when we look at that 30% number, it's often done relative to known housing costs, but there's a lot of unknown housing costs like utility cost burden that are quite large and significant and essentially compound over time as households might just pay a portion of those payments. You know, so nationally, we know that we were in a housing affordability crisis going into the pandemic. And the city of Philadelphia very much was emblematic of that, with a large share of households cost burden, extremely cost burden. That cost burden clearly usually falls on the lowest income households by virtue of the metric, right? Income versus rent. But the reality is that also it usually then falls on renters who tend to be lower income. In a city like Philadelphia, with a fair share of lower income homeowners, what's interesting is that there's a fair number of housing cost burden homeowners. And some of those might not even have a mortgage, right? Some of those might just be through kind of upkeep and utilities associated with the property itself. And so the problem is large, and it's not specific to one group, but generally the lower income you are, the more likely you are to be housing cost burden. To throw out one number nationally, less than 1% of households with income below $20,000 are spending less than 20% of their income on housing. So, you know, this is a function, like Nikil said before, and like Anne's pointed to already, of a lot of constraints, not just supply, but also the fact that some incomes are so incredibly low that you can't build housing cheap enough that's still affordable, right? This is something I've heard Anne say on other panels as well. You know, when you get to incomes that low, that 30% number is essentially very easy to get to. So the pandemic has only made that worse, right? With income shocks most affecting those groups as well, right? Service sector workers being affected the most, minority households, and particularly Black households, being affected the most by the pandemic, both through the economic shock, but also through the disproportionate effect of exposure of COVID on these groups, right? And so what that's done is that's actually created a tremendous amount of need. One of the challenges is that it's hard to quantify that need in any setting, no less in a pandemic, right? And particularly because that need is formalized in rent arrears, where people are not necessarily able to pay all their rent, so it formalized in a known rent arrear number, but also other forms of debt. So our surveys of households in Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and other cities show that a significant number of households have taken on large other forms of debt in order to pay for their housing, right? So that gets hidden, right? Because it's on credit cards, it's borrowing from family, it's extending all forms of credit and access to dollars as much as possible to remain housed. And so again, when we think of these realities, we often rely on a metric like 30% when it's hiding all of these other really intense realities and trade-offs that households are facing, which leads us to a potential eviction crisis, you know, once the federal eviction moratorium expires. So right now evictions are low, right? Because you're not allowed to evict. The city of Philadelphia very much is at the forefront of requiring households to go through the rent relief program in order to file an eviction. They also have what's being nationally regarded as a case study in their eviction diversion program for really kind of active policy to manage the eviction process. That said, you know, the rent relief tries to do this, but there is the clear need to acknowledge that rent relief isn't enough, right? This problem existed before the pandemic, and without significant, consistent commitment to resources, it'll go after as well. So I'll stop there.
Let me turn to Tayyib Smith. One of the most important aspects of housing inequality is the role that past policy has played in creating race inequality and segregation in housing. While this topic is deserving of many sessions of its own, can you begin to lay out for us how Black and Brown, not only individuals, but also developers have faced exclusion in the housing market?
Okay, so thank you for that. Thank you for the invite. And I want to apologize for I probably was the person who turned in my essay last, but I appreciate being invited. But there's a couple points I want to touch on before even getting to like developers being excluded. I had an observation probably about 3 or 4 years ago that a lot of people were sending me like emails or inboxes about people that I should collaborate with as real estate developers. And I had the learning or unlearning that a lot of people, particularly in under-resourced or undercapitalized spaces, didn't know the difference between flipping a house and being a commercial developer or being a large, let's say, a large project developer, right? And through nomenclature, things mean different things to different people. So there's a disingenuous narrative when we talk about real estate and we talk about, particularly Black and Brown communities, because real estate in Western culture arguably has been anti-Black since inception, right? Even if you think of the Great Migration, African-American communities moved into communities that were already built. And frankly, in the Philadelphia region, the reason that you have a larger propensity of African-Americans in West Philadelphia than in the river wards is because of land covenants. And there were land covenants in the region that made it so that you couldn't sell to a Jewish family, a Southeast Asian family, someone of African descent, or someone of not a Christian religion. So the first families that had the opportunity sold from Jewish to African American. And if you were to go to Detroit, if you were to go to Cleveland, you will find similar census tracts that have that path, right? So there's a confluence of issues that have displaced African Americans from the positionality to design their own communities. I often mention there are fewer than 500 African American women working as architects in the United States. Every building we see in the city of Philadelphia that is currently under construction needs an external and interior architect. That's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars over a lifetime, right? I've had meetings in Pipeline that I wasn't invited to, but because I'm a partner there, hey, what's going on here? And there would be one African-American person there with 80 people there, and I found out it was a commercial brokers meeting, right? Growing up in a poor community, I didn't know what a commercial broker was. So if you are fortunate enough to have the contract to be a commercial broker on a building in Philadelphia and Center City, you make money in perpetuity and you don't do any work. That's a space that African Americans are completely out of the deal flow. So I could go across sector from the leadership of nonprofits, the leadership of think tanks, the executives who have dominion over Black and Brown communities, from health, wellness, infrastructure, architecture, job flow, deal flow, procurement. And virtually we have an ecosystem that has a white gaze, and the African American men, women, marginalized people who are in them have to carry talking points for white-led institutions that don't support innovation or change. So, the reason that my essay was called Black City, White Problems is that Philadelphia in particular is a city that still has the infrastructure from the age of white flight. If you look at the positionality of executives who work at anchor institutions, the positionality of people who work at the corporations and nonprofits that have the largest annual budgets, they're white-led. If you look at where the money flows, we're sitting at 67% POC, 43% African American, and it was more African American in my youth. The people who came here, like my great grandparents, 3 generations ago, they came here escaping white supremacy and structural violence from southern cities, right? Came here, some of them became veterans, some of them went into factories, some of them went into municipality, but some of the same people worked alongside of them at the city of Philadelphia or at nonprofits or corporations were fortunate enough to benefit from the New Deal policies, from the jobs of the New Deal policies, and also the structural racism that locked us into census tracts where we couldn't create wealth. So we have a 10x differential between Black household wealth and white household wealth nationally. And in Philadelphia, that is something that particularly constrains us in a city that is predominantly Black. But we have an ecosystem that monetizes the poverty versus has a spirit of innovation. And I could say a lot more, but I think that's why we have so many people who fall into this catch-22, because we will say to you that you're not capitalized, or you don't have the family, friends and family around to do it, or you don't have a relative who can park money in your account so that you're capitalized to actually do a deal. So you don't get the resilience to become a larger developer. But then at the same time, I deal with culturally incompetent people with very little experience who are born in the right census tract or have the right relative, and they're able to get scalability, contracts, the benefit of intergenerational structural racism, and people don't hold them to a fictitious standard of meritocracy.
Thank you, and we'll definitely circle back and hear more, because you're trying to take some creative solutions to a very complex problem. So we'll hear more about that in a little bit. But that's a good transition in some ways to Samantha Porter, and I want to ask you about how the exclusion of community voices has been part of the housing crisis. Have we failed to take a community approach to housing problems in the past? And then we'll hear about, again, some interesting work you've done on this front a little later in the panel.
I also want to thank you for allowing me to join this really wonderful panel. And Temple, Tayyib actually raises a lot of the points just to begin. So I'll echo him and just being clear, when we're talking about community, oftentimes that becomes code for Black and Brown sections of the community. So I want to be really clear that we define that. We have a lot of different stakeholders across Philadelphia. We're talking about low to moderate income individuals. We're talking about Black, Brown, immigrant, all of these things. And we sort of kind of use the term community. And so I would say that the community voice hasn't been excluded from the conversation. This week I'm participating in CRC, and at that table, they're talking about CRA and the power of the CRA, and there are a lot of advocates who are very much involved. I think the challenge comes in when it's time for what community's asking for to be implemented. And therefore, Anne sort of alluded to this with, we have some funding mechanisms that are inflexible. We have some processes that still very much capture structural racism. So Tayyib made this point about who's in charge. When I go out to hear from stakeholders and talk about, what we're seeing in terms of trends, the majority of the people in those rooms are white people. Those are white, people who have had a certain type of experience, perhaps not an immigrant experience. So there's just a lot of things that are missing from the decision-making tables. So community voice is not necessarily excluded. And we have some great examples. I wrote about the trauma zone, where we have really deep and long-term community engagement. But once the community has identified, well, what we need here is this type of supportive housing, or what we need here is access to the capital that Tayyib's talking about so that we can participate in, realizing some of the wealth of this community, or access to loans that help us repair, older housing stock, then that's where we get the disconnect, I think. And that's where I would say the exclusion takes place. So, that's been my experience. And I would also say, there's a lot that happens in the private market versus government. And so, we're thinking about solutions and we're thinking about the policy approaches there. There's only so much that government regulates in the private market. And so we have a real tension and challenge with community members. And, I don't want to oversimplify that, but but stakeholders from a variety of different communities who don't have influence on what happens in the private market. They don't have influence around appraisals in their communities to realize housing, wealth in their housing. They don't have access to the family members and the wealth networks that might create capital, outside of traditional lending. It's very, very hard then to monitor what's happening from a lending perspective because there's all of these sort of private market stressors. When we want to develop affordable housing, there's other housing developments that happen on the private market that we don't have any visibility into. So from a policy perspective and a government perspective, I think that's where the exclusion comes into play. And also, I would be remiss. I have to say the views that I express here today are my views and my views alone. It wouldn't be an event if I didn't share my Fed disclaimer. So I just want to make that absolutely clear.
We're very happy to have your views, and even if they represent only you. Let me turn to Diana and shift the conversation a little bit, although clearly there are connections here, and ask you how the focus on the single family home has created problems, both with affordability and with equity, and really a sense of social isolation.
So a lot of cities around the country right now are trying to tackle issues of equity, issues of segregation, issues of environmental justice, and issues of affordability. And in looking at how to address that in terms of their housing, really kind of recognizing the role that the single family home has played in kind of creating many of these various different kinds of problems, whether it's the kind of racist exclusion that Tayyib was mentioning in the past, or the ways in which single family homes have kind of artificially raise some of the housing prices in their cities. They're really trying to figure out how does single family zoning play into a larger picture of addressing these kinds of issues. To your question of how do single family homes kind of intersect with this affordability issue, I would say that there's sort of three main ways in which single family homes kind of contribute to the affordability crisis. The first being that it's not the most efficient use of our land. So if you have, a neighborhood that has amenities and schools and jobs and whatnot, and people want to access that neighborhood, and you're building single family homes there, you're naturally going to only have a limited number of people who are going to be able to conveniently access that particular neighborhood if you're building single family homes there. If you build more multifamily homes, if you build or multifamily buildings, if you build homes that are accessible to multi-generational families, if you build co-living, if you build single room occupancy buildings, a much more diverse set of housing types, there are opportunities to house more people and give them access to those neighborhoods, and naturally sort of make that neighborhood more affordable to more people, because you're sort of creating more supply and you're also making those neighborhoods more accessible. The second way I would say it also kind of creates an affordability issue is that single family homes tend to be larger than maybe many people can actually afford. So if your average single family home in the US is going to be 2,000 square feet or whatnot, many people can't afford 2,000 square feet. They could afford 100 square feet. They could afford 200 square feet. And there's not a lot of housing out there that is actually meeting that price point. And so if we have housing that is actually, that allows people to have housing opportunities that are smaller size, whether that's through more communal housing or whether that's through smaller apartments or smaller house sizes, that's one way to also address the affordability issue. I'd say lastly, single family homes also, by virtue of the fact that everyone has to, in a single family home, get their own appliances, pay their own utility bills and so on. There's a lot of sort of individual or household level burden that could be better shared across more people if living in another fashion. So those are some of the ways in which single family homes kind of contribute to rising housing costs. As far as the social isolation aspect of it, single family homes are a relatively new way for people living. And frankly, even today in many countries around the world, a lot of people don't live as sort of individual households within their own house. They live in multi-generational situations. They live in more communal kinds of housing environments. And so, whereas 100 years ago, people's households had an average of 7 people in them. Today, many people are sort of socially isolated at home. So that's, one aspect of how that kind of contributes to that social isolation issue is if you're really sort of, as many of us are, spending a ton of time at home, you have a limited set of opportunities to connect with people. And many communities that are set up around sort of single family homes don't really have intentional community or ways to access community in the same way. And as more people sort of turn inward, there's a tendency to be less invested in kind of communal, say, rec centers or parks or other shared amenities that people might otherwise access.
Now that we've identified some of the problems in housing, let's dive a little deeper into thinking about some particular areas of the challenge and start talking about some of the solutions that all of you do work on. So let's talk first about rental affordability. And I want to turn to Vincent Reina and ask you, President Biden has proposed increasing funding for housing vouchers and also to make the program universal for all eligible families. Can you first say what that means and how, in what way they have not been universal? Because I don't think everyone understands that. And can you say something about how housing vouchers might be improved to reduce housing instability?
So that's a great question. So first, it is really interesting. We have our first president who actually referred to a right to housing and also put a universal Section 8 voucher on their platform. Right. This is actually very much unprecedented, both in the framing of it, but also in proposing that idea. Right. And so one thing that's been well documented for some time is we've had a systemic underinvestment in housing from the federal government, and particularly in low-income housing. They've retrenched from investing in housing year after year after year, and often it's just a political fight to get to the same point, despite the need increasing dramatically, right? So across the country, for every one household who receives housing assistance, there's another 3 who do not. I'm working on a study on the Section 8 voucher lottery in Los Angeles. What happened was the city of Los Angeles had a waiting list for Section 8 vouchers. They ran through the waiting list after using it for about 15 years. They needed to renew the waiting list, not because they got new vouchers, but just because they recycle old vouchers as people stopped using them. So they did a lottery. Why'd they do a lottery? Because we estimate that there were 560,000 households who were income eligible for the voucher, right? They then received 170,000 applications from income eligible households to be put on the wait list. From there, they did a lottery and put 20,000 on the wait list. Why 20,000? Because they knew that at most they can offer 1,000 people a voucher on any given year, because all they were doing was recycling the ones they weren't using anymore, right? And so 20,000 was already extreme because it might take a long time to get to that number. And anything beyond that is even more false hope for folks who are waiting on this wait list, right? As you might expect, and we all know, as we would expect, the trade-offs that households are facing while they're waiting for a voucher, hoping for assistance they need, are dire, right? And so this has been a consistently undersupply of vouchers where we're essentially telling 2 equally eligible folks, one gets it because of a lottery and one doesn't, right? That shows that we have no safety net, we have no right to housing, and we're critically far from that, right? So the statement of the universal voucher is the idea that any income eligible household who applies for a voucher can apply and receive the voucher, right? So that's a big endeavor on its own, because it essentially, in theory, increases the safety net. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the voucher, like every other policy tool, is not perfect. It's not a panacea. There's a lot of challenges around it. It is very valuable in that a tenant pays no more than 30% of their income towards their housing, and HUD pays the difference between the two. But the tenant still actually has to use that voucher. And so in my own research, we found that Black households with kids, and elderly households are disproportionately less able to use a voucher than a similar white household or a household without kids or a middle-aged household, right? And so what that means is vouchers don't work the same for everyone, right? And in many ways, we give people the subsidy and we expect it just to solve all our problems, right? So you get this benefit, everyone can use it. But the reality is, as Tayyib and others have said on this call already, there's systemic discrimination in our market, right? So that subsidy on its own is not going to work the same for any two households, right? And issues of racial discrimination very much kind of show itself in not just voucher use rates, but even where the neighborhood someone could move to with a voucher. So again, in some of my work, we found that Black households in Cook County, on average, lived with the voucher, lived on neighborhoods with a 9 percentage point higher poverty rate than the same income white household, right? And so this points to the fact that, you know, to get the voucher to work, source of income discrimination laws are key. Things like housing support to help someone find a housing unit. A lot of the housing authorities essentially offer you the voucher and say, go look for a unit. And now you have to go on the market and you might get rejected 4 times before you find someone. A housing authority might give you a list of folks they have just from hearsay, right? This isn't kind of a broad set of lists. This isn't a broad set of resources. And so there's a lot of assistance that could be provided in the housing search process. So it's to say the housing need's high. There is clearly an undersupply of Section 8 vouchers. The call for universal Section 8 vouchers is an incredible statement and movement in the correct direction. But even with different levers in place, we need to acknowledge that it underserves a lot of individuals, particularly Black households, households with kids, and elderly households. And we need to kind of be acknowledging that that's one tool in our much bigger suite of resources needed to help households.
Thank you, Vincent. Tayyib, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, just to piggyback on some of what Vincent was describing, there seems to be this reoccurring narrative about the systemic structural racism, but with each generation, we never get to restitution to the public policies and the public-private partnerships that designed inequality to a certain degree. All right, so from the creation of Levittown, where Black soldiers were excluded from, but those were public dollars, right? To, you know, In the Color of Money, the author describes how there are companies that still trade on the stock exchange today that made, you know, billions of dollars off of benefiting from the scarcity and using, you know, dare I say, parasitic capital to create environments that were exploiting scarcity. All right. If you read the Wall Street Journal, you know, today, there is a boom for construction companies and, you know, REITs because of the housing crisis. Right. So if you have a financial infrastructure milieu that is simultaneously exploiting the scarcity, right? But then still, we have never had restitution, particularly to marginalized communities and Black people in particular, to the intergenerational public policy that puts us within that 10x differential in access to wealth. So the thing that gives communities agency, that gave, you know, frankly, every community that fell under the man-made construct of whiteness, you know, because a lot of people weren't white 4 or 5 generations by definition, all right? You never get restitution because our grandparents, our great-grandparents didn't get to participate in the New Deal, didn't get to participate in the, you know, policies after the 1965 Immigration Act, didn't get to, you know, CRA policy has existed since the 1970s. Banks benefit from CRA policy, but the areas where CRA policy has been executed, Black people still have a 10 to 20 year differential in life expectancy in those same census tracts. So there is what I define as a grand gaslighting, and constantly with every couple years talking about public policy to incrementally get you into rental, incrementally get you into workforce, incrementally get you into something. The same person who's writing that policy or doing the study would not allow their grandparent or their child to participate in the same system. There's a low expectation for Black life. There's a low expectation for our success. So frankly, as someone who operates across sector and is looking at this from an innovation business perspective, I have to go back to Samantha's comments about there's a lot of spaces where government is hamstrung, but also there's a disingenuous narrative because business gets a lot of subsidy to do real estate through RCAP, through LIHTC, through bids, through all the things that enable you to build buildings in Center City, but change the tax policy so that they benefit the construction industry or private developers, but not the communities that live in close proximity to them. So there is a problem of never giving restitution, but we can all talk about every generation and every public policy that excluded Black people in particular.
Can I just comment on that? Because I have to say, I agree 100% with everything Tayyib was saying. And when we talk about restrictions, one of the things I think that we find so frustrating, right, is all the things that we've alluded to, redlining. Tayyib brought up Levittown, right? People understand the redlining, which you couldn't get a mortgage, but Levittown was built with FHA financing, government financing, with the condition of we will give you government financing to build these houses only if you sell them to white people. So it wasn't just the mortgage company saying, we're not going to give a mortgage to somebody who's Black. It was government financing. So it was, for example, me as the government saying, okay, I will build these units in West Philadelphia and I will provide you subsidy with the understanding of you can only sell them to white people. And that was legal, right? In the 1950s, 60s, throughout history, when this happened, that was legal. Now, if I move forward and say, you know what? I want to ensure that if I do provide subsidy for development in West Philadelphia, that there is a requirement that at least 80% of the people have to be Black or person of color, or that 80% or 100% of the benefit, economic benefit of that goes to a developer or an owner who is Black or person of color or some other, that's illegal. I can't do that. I can't do that. And so to Tayyib's point, there are clear laws that are put in place that, yeah, we're not going to have restitution. And people are talking about, well, how do we, we have this now. And okay, let's try to get to this. We can't. We have to aim to get to this if we're going to even get close to this. And that's not what's happening right now. So I totally agree with what Tayyib is saying.
Yeah, and for people who don't know it, Tayyib referred to it. Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, really lays out this history in all of its deeply disturbing detail.
Judith, I have to mention that Dr. Kiyinga Yamada Taylor from Princeton, Race for Profit, is a better book with more solutions, and it talks about some of the restitution. I've talked to Richard about his book, and I would say arguably his solutions are a little timid. And there's also that white gaze that believes, my grandparents were able to benefit from it, but we can't do it today.
I just, while we're talking about this history and this current of race discrimination, I also just wanted to bring in the issues of race discrimination in the lending and the appraisal industries. Many of you are experts on many things. I was going to direct this question to Vincent Reina, but Vincent, do you want to jump in? And if anyone else sort of wanted to talk about this, please feel free.
If we're holding up books, this is a good one on the topic. Know Your Price by Andre Perry. So also kept by my computer at all points in time, and what he does in his amazing work, both through the Brookings site, but also through his book, is really show the kind of systemic devaluing of Black households' assets and their property values, right? So there's been a lot of kind of evidence and proof showing that Black households have had their housing units undervalued consistently. And this then means that Black households face increased barriers to access to credit, which affects homeownership rates. But then even once they become homeowners, they're less likely to benefit from the wealth creation aspect of homeownership, right? That's particularly striking because for Black households, even though they have overall much lower wealth, lower homeownership rates, and lower housing equity, actually comprises the largest share of Black wealth, right? So what it means is we're systemically blocking access, but then devaluing the main portion of Black households' wealth. And what that does is it then compounds, right? It's multi-generational, as Tayyib was saying, right? But also it compounds even to things like business and entrepreneurship, right? And so you know that a lot of people use their home as leverage to access loans for their small businesses, things along those lines, right? So it kind of compounds on those multiple levels, not just through the wealth creation of the housing unit itself, but also through the things people do that with that equity to leverage other assets to then develop businesses and things along those lines. So I'll stop there because this panel, a lot of other folks can speak more actively to this.
Okay, Diana, I think I saw your hand first.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing, maybe just also linking Tayyib and Vincent's points, Tayyib calling for some more bold solutions. I mean, I think that we have a problem in general with having the primary source of wealth creation and stability for families being wrapped up in home ownership. And it sort of seems like every generation's solution to trying to address this wealth gap is to try to get more people to be homeowners, instead of actually saying, we've spent 100 years perfecting the home ownership model, the 30-year mortgage, this sort of wealth creation model. We've spent like zero time thinking about other ways to actually build wealth. And I think that the sort of populist stock market moment that we're in right now actually sort of indicates a real hunger that people have for figuring out how are they actually going to create wealth for themselves in new ways. And I think that it is an appropriate time for us to really start thinking about with innovative developers like Tayyib and others, how can we actually start creating wealth that isn't solely wrapped up in people's individual homes and their property values, which pit people's sort of, their social values against their financial wealth, perhaps. And that also kind of, we're in a very tricky moment right now where houses are not just where people live, but they're also commodities. They're also being bought up by the thousands by corporations. And I don't know what the future is going to be like in, 10, 20 years in terms of people actually even being regular homeowners anymore. So let's get ahead of that curve and actually start thinking about how can we what could be some new financial models out there. And so we really need to kind of jump on that. And I think there's been very little, discussion about sort of saying we've tried this building wealth through home ownership thing for too long. We have to start thinking about new ways.
Thank you. Samantha Porter.
I'll be brief because I really want to piggyback on something important that Diana has pointed out, and that is there's a belief around maximizing wealth through housing. And I think one of the things that indicates is just a lack of access to credit, right? So we have communities that don't have access to funds. And, so we are using the one piece that has been, road tested. And I think that part of this conversation around affordability with housing is, for me, in my mind, around stabilizing communities so that we can have people live in a place for a longer period of time, and therefore the planning that is possible around wealth generation changes. Your prospect for that changes. It doesn't become a community situation where you're trying to say, I want to be on the forefront of this sort of gentrification in order to realize wealth through this one asset. Rather, you're stabilized in a way that's affordable, so you can then make the investment in knowing that you're building a school that's going to support your children so that they move on to the next thing, that there are businesses that you're going to support over the long term. There's a larger ecosystem around affordability that I think when we're talking about housing affordability, that sometimes we focus too much on the house as the specific aspect or the specific asset rather than the reverberations of having these sort of affordability structures in our community. So I just really wanted to build on that because I think the wealth creation is part of it. I absolutely think the restitution is part of it, reparations, frankly. But I think that we also have to think about how can we help to stabilize people so they're investing in the multitude of ways to develop wealth in our communities, particularly Black and Brown ones.
Okay, I just wanted to, so we sort of moved into home ownership, and before we move too far away from renters and the issues facing renters, I just wanted to get two more things on the table. And that first is, I did want to ask Anne Fadullon to talk a little bit more about some of the creative approaches that the city is taking to helping renters.
So I think, the city's approach to this touches on something that Diana just brought up, which is housing as a commodity. This whole wealth creation conversation, all of that is tied in that there are a lot of housing markets in the country where housing is not about housing a family or a household. It's about how can I earn as much return as possible. And I think the programs that we tried to set up that we were starting to set up anyway, and then accelerated greatly because of the pandemic, were really, how do you address that issue? Because coming out of the recession, housing markets that were already strong in that huge foreclosure, where we saw home ownership foreclosure and people lose their houses, when a bank takes a house back, the bank is not like, I wonder who I could sell this one house to. The bank is a bank, and the bank is about making money. They're not real estate folks. They don't do that, right? So they took back literally thousands of houses and packaged them and then sold them to an investor. Right. An investor was not interested in, oh my God, how can I get Mrs. Jones into this house or Mr. Smith into that house? They were like, oh, now I have this investment. How can I make as much return as possible? And so all those home ownership houses got flipped into investment properties. They became rental properties. And the only objective was to earn a profit. 20, 25% oftentimes, because they were REITs, they were investment pools. It turned into just as if you were buying a stack on a stock market. It had nothing to do with the moral right of providing housing. We were very concerned about that happening to our housing market, because going into the pandemic, Philadelphia's housing market was getting to the point where it had value as a commodity. We did not worry about it coming out of the 2008 to 12 recession because we weren't there yet. We are there now. And the other thing compounding that factor in Philadelphia is that a huge percentage of our affordable housing, probably 90+%, is not provided by any kind of public market subsidy. It's not the housing authority. It's not subsidized low income tax credits. It's private housing. And most of that, over 70%, is provided by landlords that have 10 or fewer units. These are very, very small landlords, extremely susceptible if they don't collect rent for a year, for 18 months, that they are going to lose those units to foreclosure. They will be packaged, they will be sold off to investors, and we will have lost our housing market in Philadelphia, and it will just be an investment market. So we came out with products designed to both hopefully support renters and keep them in their homes by providing rent assistance so that they could pay their rent, but that rent went to these small landlords so that they could also pay their mortgage and hold on to these units. We also provided working capital lines of credit to landlords so that if there was a time where it takes a long time to get this infrastructure up and running to get that assistance out, and that landlord may be going 3 or 4 months without getting that assistance. And so we opened up a working capital line of credit so they could get that and they could tap into that. We opened up a approved improvement loan in order to make improvements so that they could maintain those units as well. And then what we found out is it's complicated, right? It's complicated to say we've got to get a certain amount of information from landlords. We've got to get a certain amount of information from tenants. Tying back to the initial question about all the restrictions that come with federal funding, most of the money we had to do with this came from the feds. There is a clear-cut systemic racism issue with when you provide assistance directly to somebody, and the somebody close, similar to the community comment, is generally seen that if someone needs assistance by federal, that they are a person of from the government, they're a person of color, and oh my gosh, they cannot be trusted if we just give them money directly, right? Can't do that. They're all on the take. They're all lazy. They don't want to work. You know, there's not a bigger bucket of BS out there. Just not true. But anyway, a lot of federal requirements, takes time to get the money out. We were able to shift that over time to say, hey, we don't see anywhere really written in the fine point where we couldn't give money directly to tenants as long as we tied it back into rent and blah, blah, blah. So we've got a big effort through there were several iterations of this, but we ended up pushing money out directly to tenants just in order to get them with the understanding it would go to pay their rent. We offered up to $9,000 worth of assistance. The average ask we got was $4,700. No one came in trying to lie to us to say, well, I need $9,000. No, people came in and they asked for what they needed, and the money has gone to pay their rent, you know, maybe their utility bill, maybe they need to get their kids asthma medicine that month, and then they paid the rent, like whatever it is. We did not have any incidents really of anybody trying to misuse the dollars. But the key point is you've got to pay attention to both the renter and the landlord's side. If you've got a market like Philadelphia, which is supplied predominantly by small landlords who are at risk of losing those units, and were more willing to make deals with their tenants because they cared about keeping those tenants in those units. When your housing market becomes a commodity, all bets are off.
Thank you, Anne. And let me just turn to Senator Saval and ask about, you know, one of our biggest concerns when we think about renter affordability, and that is eviction. You know, currently there is this federal moratorium on eviction or during the pandemic that will end, one presumes. What can we do to try to prevent eviction?
Thanks, and I would be remiss in not just echoing. I was so relieved when Tayyib brought up Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book and how good it is, and how, anyway, I just want to echo that. It's just a phenomenal book. I was really proud to, in my previous life, to publish part of it in a journal. So it was just, anyway, it's great. I mean, it's a great book. But I just want to, so, you know, I mean, Anne started to describe this, and Professor Reina described the kind of the had a little bit of a caution about the issue, but I would say that the most important measure right now is rental assistance, which is just that we have a huge amount of federal rental assistance. We need to stay on top of the distribution of the federal dollars. We need to spend 65% of the statewide funds by September. Otherwise, Pennsylvania returns or is obligated to return a lot of that money back to the federal government to be redistributed elsewhere. In other words, it goes from Pennsylvania to the Treasury and then to California or New York or what have you. And we need the money. It's not because the money we don't need it. It's just because, as you know, Anne mentioned, there are restrictions, and a lot of it, I mean, and far more restrictions than there should be. A lot of that having to do with, you know, with fundamentally racist ideas about who is deserving of assistance, and if they receive that assistance, what they should be required to do to get it. So we've been, I would just say that since we are active in this, you know, our office has been doing our best to support to support PHDC. We hosted an event to answer questions around it. We had it in a couple different languages as well, in Mandarin and Spanish. And so we need, I mean, the need for rental assistance, frankly, predated the pandemic. It just is going to be needed afterwards. And so I think the kind of like big infrastructure that is being created in Philadelphia and elsewhere needs to be scaled up across the state, honestly, and it's a real model. But one thing I just want to kind of talk about as well, which is related to eviction, is and this predates the pandemic as well, is what happens when an eviction is filed against you, which is that you have a record, basically, even if you beat your case. And so one thing that we're working on, and this, you know, fuels further further housing insecurity, one thing we're working on at a state level is what we're calling eviction ceiling, and that's SEALING, not just to be clear. And the eviction data that gets fed into tenant screening services is what landlords rely on for background checks. These services are compromised because when you put garbage in a system, it spits garbage back out. The database is, they screen tenants based on eviction filings, as I said, and an eviction filing doesn't equate to an eviction. It just simply meant that a tenant had to appear in court. And then based on what happens in court, tenants who are found to be in the wrong will wind up with a judgment filed against them. But if tenants who did nothing wrong, or basically who beat their case, do not. And so we need legislation that will reduce the number of just false positives that wind up in these data sets. We need records of tenants who have not had a judgment filed against them kept out of these databases. There's actually thousands and thousands of people. And that is hugely fuels housing insecurity. It is not the entire case, but it is a big part of it. And so the status quo means that people who have not had an eviction, who have not had a judgment, can be thrust into housing insecurity because of a dispute with a single landlord. And so this is something that we can do at a state level. We believe we can move it. And it's something we're really passionate about. And it is related to our overall eviction crisis and housing insecurity crisis.
Vincent, did you want to say something quickly on that, or are you?
Well, to Nikil's point about the need to get the dollars at the door, it's absolutely crucial. And what we do is we don't fund government for a very long time. And now it's a pandemic. And fortunately, the government actually devoted resources towards renters. In the past moments like this, they haven't necessarily done that. But then we're basically said, okay, we haven't invested in your capacity. We haven't invested in community-based organizations, but here's money, get it out the door to people who need it right now in the middle of a pandemic when we can't even engage with each other in person, at least initially at all, right? And so I think it's really important as we kind of talk about all this to really kind of remind ourselves the fact that, we've underinvested in government and government programs for so long. I mean, over 75% of rent relief programs across the country are completely new because there is no funds for that beforehand, right? And so as we kind of think of these challenges we're talking about, it's not saying government's the solution for everything, blah, 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 but it's to say that there's room for innovation, and we need to acknowledge that we now can't point a finger at government if money's not getting out fast enough. I mean, Nikil just said, we're hosting events, we're doing this, right? The people are working hard, and government's not perfect, no one's perfect, but it's all to say that I do think we're starving our investments in government and community organizations, and then we expect them to excel in moments of crisis and then punish them if they don't. And that's a really wicked system that we really need to get out of and reframe.
Thank you. I do just want to put one other topic quickly on the table, and that is, which we haven't talked about yet, and that is the problem of homelessness. And so, Anne Fadullon, if I could just trouble you to let us know kind of what's happening in terms of the encampments that were here last summer. The city agreed to turn over 50 properties to a land trust and to develop certain housing units. Can you just tell us kind of where that stands?
I'll tell you as much as I know, to be honest with you. So that was spearheaded by the Office of Homeless Services, which is sort of associated with us, but not necessarily under the purview of the Department of Planning and Development. However, I believe that the leadership of the encampment folks have been identifying publicly owned properties. They've been touring those properties, and I think that's underway. I think it has not been an easy process. It's hard to coordinate everybody's schedules. And unfortunately, I think what they are realizing is that we don't have a lot of structures that are in very good condition. Most of our structures are actually in deplorable condition. Some of the structures they identified by the time we get there have been demolished because they're imminently dangerous or have been determined to be unsafe. However, I believe that process is ongoing, and that the encampment organizers are setting up their entity and they're raising funds, and it's underway. But it's just not an easy process.
Thank you. And I hope there's a lot more obviously to talk about homelessness. So there is the issue of whether homelessness, can be addressed through the kinds of programs we're talking about, or needs like a completely different approach. So
Give us some flexible dollars and we can deal with this issue. But don't continue to give us dollars that are impossible to spend and then say, to the point that everybody was just making, why haven't you spent those dollars? We could make a huge dent in this issue if we were provided flexible dollars, particularly flexible operating dollars.
Okay. All right, I think there are lots more topics to discuss. Luckily, you all wrote beautiful essays. We didn't even get to talk about the West Philadelphia Promise Zone, which Samantha Porter's essay is on. So those who are interested in the West Philadelphia Promise Zone, please check out Samantha's essay. And we have more questions for Diana Lind, but please read her book and read her essay, which is a great kind of preview of the book. But I do just want to give the panel kind of a lightning round to finish up before we turn to questions. If everyone could give like a 20-second answer to this, because we have a lot of questions. And that is that, as part of pandemic relief, and there's, and also more generally a kind of new attitude towards social policy in this pandemic era, there have been a lot of new approaches and funding sources that have been put on the table for discussion. What is one housing issue that we should all be following over the next year? I'm sure there are many, but if you could each say what one is. And let's start with Diana Lind.
Sure. I would say that I am really interested to see how federal funding for housing shifts away from focusing on single family homes and encouraging cities to kind of loosen some of their zoning regulations and encourage more other housing types. I'm also really interested to see how this kind of idea of housing as infrastructure plays out more generally, and kind of potentially how we reimagine the idea of the connections between all of our types of infrastructure and how it intersects with housing itself.
Thank you. Samantha Porter.
Yeah, on the positive side, I would say I'm really interested in seeing how we continue to develop rental assistance. I think Anne highlighted some of the really amazing and exciting innovations across the country. Dr. Reina, I know you're researching that. So I think this is something that I'm really interested in and curious about. I think on the negative side, this housing market that we're seeing right now is really showing some concerning trends around not owner occupied, cash sales through investors. And I think that ultimately, if we don't keep our eye on the ball, that private movement has real implications for our affordability in Philadelphia specifically, but I think across the country.
Great. Senator Saval.
For me, I think it's been floated a little bit in some of the Biden proposals, but it's everywhere. It's just the connection that I think is being drawn more readily between our broad ecological and environmental crisis and our housing crisis, and the need to really create housing is a huge source of emissions. We've already talked about utility burdens and that portion of the energy crisis. Can we unite our environmental and housing goals? Can we attack housing inequality and environmental injustice at the same time, and create a kind of green housing program? I mean, I think that is really what we need. And when you from the inside out, we've talked about home repairs, we've talked about the fact that people have so many different ways that an increasingly volatile climate is going to affect their homes, to the fact that the energy in these homes, the fact that people use natural gas in their homes, and that's a huge source of toxicity, of asthma. This is non-trivial. I mean, across our country, this is enormous. And it is a huge workforce development opportunity. Like, we need people to do the work to retrofit and repair all of our homes. You really feel that in Philadelphia or in Pennsylvania, where we have an aging housing stock. Our housing, is much of it built before, built decades, even centuries ago. This to me is the fundamental challenge of our time, insofar as the climate crisis is really the challenge of our time. But I think that we can do these things at once, and this strikes me as something, I think we should all dedicate ourselves to, and it has bearing on on everything, on the questions that Diana raised, for example, with regards to how profligate and just like our in terms of our land use and things like that, single family homes and the like have been, how environmentally destructive that is. I think all of these things are tied in.
Thank you. Tayyib Smith.
I think Philadelphia is the perfect place to design a holistic solution to the housing crisis. And we have to, when I say holistic, we can't just look at it through, rental or the lens of homelessness. We have to think of families, communities, ecosystems, how people are working, how they're looking at their wellness. And too often as practitioners, we navel gaze and we look at things with one tool versus a whole tool belt or a whole toolbox, or a suite of resources to look at solutions. And to be frank, we have anchor institutions in this region that draw people from around the world, and in walking distance, in close proximity to Temple and Penn, you have upwards of 36% poverty. I think I read a few years ago that if you're between 19 and 21, and if you're African American or Latino, you're 537 times less likely to have access to an entry-level internship or job, right? So if we're not thinking holistically about the millennials and Gen Z who are born here, right? Because in nomenclature, we portray the truth, right? When we talk about Gen Z, when we talk about the new economy, when we talk about the knowledge economy, we are talking about international products of education, real estate, business development, but we're not thinking about the homegrown native Philadelphians. And if we don't think of how we're going to educate people so they can get into the institutions that are in walking distance of their homes versus getting sent to the middle of the state to be used as profit and fodder for the incarceration system, right? If we're putting $13,000 per student in the city of Philadelphia, 23 to 30, or even more if they're in private school, and expecting them to participate in a meritocratic market in the 21st century economy, when we have 30% reading levels with third graders in the city of Philadelphia, and graduation rates below 60% sometimes, we are not transformatively looking towards the future as a solution. We're doing trickle down displacement of the homegrown people here, and we're using tax rebates and using financial products to trickle down them out into the suburbs, because poverty is rapidly rising in the suburbs. And those people still have to use public transportation or pay too much for transportation to get low wage jobs in the city. And if we don't have courage across sector in the business community, in philanthropy, in academia and bureaucracy, we are going to have the same conversations in a continuum.
All right. A lot to follow in the next year, for sure. Vincent Reina.
So I'm gonna follow the group here and reference Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, who had a recent article in the Atlantic where she said, "Is this recent round of funding a one-time thing or a shift in the way we view investment in people and place and the role of government and all these kind of just a broader seismic shift?" And so I think, to me, that's what I'm interested in seeing. This federal commitment, it's a response to the pandemic that's needed, but most of these issues existed before and they'll exist after if we don't structurally shift and commit. And so will we have a right to housing, right? The president said it, so let's see it happen.
All right, thank you. And Anne Fadullon, 20 seconds so we can get to some questions.
Just piggybacking on what everybody else said, and I think Tayyib brings out a great point, is I'm paying attention to what happens with the minimum wage. In Philadelphia, median rent for a one-bedroom apartment is $900 a month, which does not sound astronomical, right? That sounds reasonable. Housing costs money. There's a certain amount that just you have to pay to keep the lights on, to pay the property taxes, to maintain it, whatever. $900, you have to earn $18.65 an hour in order to be not cost burdened by that rent, to over 2.5 times current minimum wage, right? We can't fix this if we're not looking across the board at several issues and keep using our peripheral vision, because we need to provide everybody a house. They be able to live there, but they also need to be able to send their kids to school, pay for food, buy medicine, pay their utility bills. All those things not possible at $7.25 an hour. And it's not sustainable to have to work 3 or 4 jobs just to try to sustain. Just not sustainable at all. We need to fix that. We have the resources in this country to do it. We should be ashamed of ourselves.
Okay, thank you all very much for this discussion, and let me put some questions out there. So our first one really has to do with the frustration of dealing with when one is in the process of being evicted. What does a person do when a landlord and their accountant refuse to acknowledge a judgment being paid and having raised rent during pandemic? What do you do if an entry of satisfaction hasn't been completed when you have formally paid to request in court? I'm still being threatened. I was denied financing based on a lie. I didn't have 2 months rents I had receipts for. So I just, if you could, if someone wants to address the issue of how difficult it is to be in the court system over rent.
I mean, the court system is definitely not geared towards the tenant. And then it's particularly not geared to a tenant who may not have very much resources. And so we do provide, we do have partners in community legal services and TURN, which I always forget what TURN stands for, but it's basically the tenants' rights organization. So I would encourage you to reach out to both of those entities. Similar to what you've heard from a lot of people, and part of this call is we do provide funding for them. Unfortunately, we are not able to resource them to the level that they need to be resourced, because we are not resourced at the level that we need to be resourced. But community legal services does provide either free or low cost legal services for tenants. And then there is a hotline for tenants that TURN provides that then will help refer those folks to the appropriate service entities.
Okay. Next question. The FEMA funds have not run out. Why are you saying that they have run out?
So it's my understanding, again, the Office of Housing, Supportive Housing is much more close to this than I am. That was my understanding from them, that the federal dollars that we received to support those units had run out. If they haven't run out, I apologize for that, but that is my understanding from the Office of Housing.
Okay.
Supportive services.
A question about homeless shelters. I know this is a very difficult question, but does anyone have any insights into best practices at homeless shelters? I think there's a fairly uniform opinion that the risk of theft and poor sanitation issues keep people out of shelters, some considering them more dangerous than being on the street.
I think we all agree that the shelter system is not a housing system. Right? It's not a housing system. And I think we have to do a better job at looking at different solutions. Again, this isn't my area of expertise per se, but I think it's not difficult to realize that the shelter system is not something we should be relying on, right? We need to figure out ways to, once somebody was in shelter, we need to do a better job of getting to transitional housing and then permanent housing. But also we need to figure out how do we bring back what we lost, right? In the 80s, we lost all of our supportive facilities. So a lot of our mental health facilities, a lot of our addiction support facilities, and what became those facilities, what replaced those facilities was the prison system. That's, again, it's not acceptable and we should be ashamed of ourselves. We really need to bring back the dollars so that we can provide appropriate mental health services. We need to start talking about mental health and not having that same stigma. we need to provide those addiction support services. But what we find that people coming out of those institutions are much more successful if they can get access to housing. Some of the other things we talked about were the barriers that the federal funds provide, where if you are addicted or you've got a criminal record or for certain types of things, then you can't get into those types of housing. I mean, it's all along the way. The system is designed to make sure that we never house anybody ever. And we really have to look at that. And honestly, it would start with additional dollars, but also what we've talked about. We need flexible dollars in order to come up with workable solutions. We've had the same dollars over and over for decades. We've been putting forth the same solutions, which are the limited solutions allowed by those dollars, has not been successful. We need to do something different.
Judith, if I could make a comment just in support of what Anne was talking about. So arguably what got me into real estate was concerned about cultural erasure and probably my own fears of poverty and dealing with housing stability my whole life. All right. So I learned about redlining from my mother cursing out real estate agents. And I was saying, you know, frankly, motherfucker, I asked you for this address and you took me here. Right. And I was so embarrassed that I'm like, Mom, why are you cursing out that man? And she mumbled something about redlining and I remembered it and I heard it throughout my life. Right. So oftentimes, even well-meaning practitioners who operate in this system don't have the lived experience or don't have a relative who has actually experienced, you know, some of these things. You know, I've actually toured homeless shelters in Philadelphia and Cleveland, and it's an experience that will mess you up for a couple of weeks if the people in that space look like your uncles, cousins, and relatives. When I first moved from Northern Liberties to Fittler Square, I would walk the Pipeline in the morning, and it really disturbed me that most of the homeless people were between my age and my father's age. So there's a different contextualization when you have proximity or lived experience in the space. And then even the most well-meaning people are approaching something with a gaze that normalizes our displacement from the economy. So there is a seriousness, a level of compassion that is missing, frankly, from the ecosystems that were not designed for our health and wellness. And that is something that is paramount in the city of Philadelphia because of the demographics that we have here. And most of the infrastructure projects that we have a large appetite to fund, you know, frankly, I'm an arts and culture guy. I could give a damn about a stadium, and a stadium costs $3 to $5 billion to build. There have been 3 or 4 stadiums built in my lifetime. If I wanted to put $1 billion into housing, most of you would call me a socialist or a radical, right? But without paying tribute to housing or to the holistic benefit of community, it affects violence. It affects our health and wellness. It actually affects our bottom line. And people say, why would I want to move my company to Philadelphia? Because I'm reading about it and it does not seem like it cares about its citizens. So we have to have more courage in terms of what we're asking for, particularly for the people who are born in this city.
I think that is a good last note. I am really sorry we ran out of time for more questions. There are really interesting questions, more on the homeless encampment and homeless services, on zoning, yes, Senator Saval, did you want to jump in at the end there?
I just wanted to make sure that this information got out. There was someone who needed possible legal help or assistance, and I put this information in the chat, and I wanted to, and Anne alluded to it, but I wanted to make clear that there is the tenant hotline number is 267-443-2500. PhillyTenant.org is the organization. My office is also available, saval@pasenate.com, 717-787-5660. Sorry, my public servant hat on, I needed to make sure that information got out.
I was actually going to say to point people to that as well, to make sure that people noticed it was in the chat. So thank you very much for sending that out. So obviously these are really important issues, and that we could have many, many sessions and conferences on this topic. And I hope that we can pick it up again in the future. And the questions, we will read them carefully and we will think about them as we fold that. We will try to fold those interests into future programming. So at this point, let me thank the audience for your attention and for your questions. Let me thank the panel for your expertise. Thank you so much, everyone. Be healthy, be well, and have a good afternoon.